Life is not easy when you're a minor Fire Emblem boss. You're always rooted to one spot, never allowed to see the world, and as soon as the army of the main character approaches, all you're usually allowed to do is exclaim how you'll never be bested by such chumps. Only to then be forced to say your long practiced final words a few turns later, never to return. And yet, some bosses have stuck with me personally and with us as a community, so it is possible to break free from predictable tropes and have at least some impact with your limited screen time. That's exactly what I want to tackle today, the most memorable bosses in Fire Emblem history, one for every game. Oh, and just so we're clear, this is about minor bosses, who appear in a few chapters here and there at most and can barely be considered characters. Otherwise, every entry would be like the main villain or a recruitable character, and what's the fun in that? Those get the spotlight enough as is. We're gonna start with Shadow Dragon, which is immediately a tricky one, because for these early games, almost every boss is either someone I'd consider a character, so too important to qualify, or a literal nobody. But hey, nobodies can be memorable too, or at least there is always a nobody who's the most memorable. And for me, personally, that honor would go to Manu, the boss of Chapter 9. And the reason for that is the mystique that comes with his figure. He is a Manakete king that rules over the Pyrathi Isles, a land he views as holy of sorts, as he mentions Marv and his group are unclean and shouldn't be there. Why he makes an exception for an entire pirate army, no clue, but his land itself is at this point completely barren and covered in ruins instead of something to actually rule over. As such, you can imagine all kinds of scenarios of what is actually going on here. A tale about a Manakete king forced to outlive his own kingdom and watch it fall, leaving him here alone? Or perhaps Manu became corrupted along the way, causing the downfall of the Pyrathi Isles by himself. We simply don't know, and the games never explain it, but that's also what makes it interesting and memorable. I don't know, I might dive deeper into it one day. It might just be Fire Emblem's oldest true mystery after all. But for now, it grants Manu the title of most memorable boss. We continue with Gaiden, or Shadows of Valentia, which actually helps out a ton here. It upgraded the presentation of the story beyond recognition, and that has cast figures who I would have probably considered bosses otherwise to now fit the criteria of full-fledged character, like Nui Baba or Desai for example. A pair of sisters who I don't think outgrow the status of mere boss though are Marla and Hestia, and they are my picks for the Valentia titles. Even though they really don't play a massive role in the plot of the game itself, they are tragically linked to it, as they're the daughters of one of the main villains, Jeddah, and the sisters of recruitable character Sonya. Unlike her, however, they are both witches, which means they are not exactly a source of great dialogue or intrigue, but instead mindless puppets. However, thanks to what Sonya shares about her sisters, about the lives they led before their corruption, and how she has made it her life goal to turn them back to normal, they still become quite memorable foes on Alm's journey through Rogel, even if, in universe, he wouldn't really know it. And that's quite the glow up for these two, compared to where they come from. I mean, in the original Gaiden, Hestia doesn't even have any dialogue whatsoever, due to her technically not being a boss, but merely an enemy. So yeah, if you want to get really technical about it, then I suppose Marla is truly the most memorable minor boss in the game. Onto Mystery of the Emblem, where I'm not gonna sugarcoat it, these bosses don't move me. They suffer from the same problems as the ones in Shadow Dragon, but since there are less of them due to several boss roles being taken on by actual characters, we don't exactly have a wide array of options. So my vote goes to Yodel, not to be confused with Yoder from The Binding Blade. They are both bishops though, as Yodel is a high-ranking member of Gaiden, or Gaiden, not sure how to pronounce it, their army, which consists entirely of mages. What makes Yodel memorable is, honestly not much, but his odd hair in both the original and the remakes definitely helps, and what has always stuck with me is how he expresses the morality of his chief's orders and whether he really did the right thing here. And while that is nothing new whatsoever, plenty of bosses have done so in the series, some recruitable and some not. What makes Yodel's words sting a little more is that one chapter later, his chief Arlen can be recruited. So while it is Yodel who has the sense of morality to question whether they are doing the right thing, he is made to die, while the chief giving these orders switches sides to Marv's army. It's tough, but it has at least made Yodel stick with me. Next up is Genealogy of the Holy War, which I don't think is packed with memorable bosses, but does have quite some intriguing and well written ones. However, I think we must face the facts here that presentation definitely plays a role in how memorable a character can be. And from that perspective, the bosses from Fire Emblem 4 and the game that came afterwards, Thracia, are both at a disadvantage compared to the rest. But hey, that doesn't really affect the internal fight between Genealogy's list of bosses, where I would say Clement is probably the one that sticks out the most. He's not super exciting, but he is the most intriguing, I'd say, especially in regards to what his philosophy with war is. He doesn't appear to be too ambitious, he isn't really looking for a fight either, he's more caught between two battling factions by accident, I guess you could say. That's also reflected in his death quote, which isn't about revenge or disbelief at being slain, but instead is a call not to forget him. Don't worry, Clement, you'll be immortalized in this video forever. Like I already touched on, Thracia is in a similar position to his predecessor, but I would argue that for the purpose of this video, they're arguably even worse off. FE4 lacked presentation, but the characterization of the bosses was above average. For Thracia, I'd say that niche quality dips a little more. So, this is gonna be one of the only times in this video where I'm gonna account for gameplay reasons in making a boss memorable, which means I'm picking Gomez. As a character, Gomez is alright. He's a crook, and he knows it, and he has at least a bit more of a backstory to him than your average bandit, so that's all well and good. Most importantly though, Gomez is insanely hard for the point of the game where you fight him at. He's fought in the Paralogue after chapter 8, early game as such, but some of his stats are closer to end game bosses. His high speed stat means he can really not be doubled, and he even has a ton of skill, which is quite unusual for warriors like him. Sure, his magic stat is low, that's his weakness, but you're not exactly at the point in the game yet where you have a ton of magic users, and those you do have will hardly be your strongest units at this point. So yeah, Gomez is quite the challenge, which has made him somewhat infamous, and that means memorable. Moving on to the Binding Blade, which I remember having pretty decent bosses, but when I went back to check, I was actually let down a little. Yeah, this game has you fight quite memorable figures, but they're not exactly minor bosses. That's an area Binding Blade is far from spectacular in. When looking over them all though, one design immediately jumps out to you. Segun. It's such a striking badass look, more memorable than some playable units I'd even argue. It really makes you wonder whether she was originally intended to indeed join your side. To further add to her memorability, she is a former friend of Yuno, and even mentioned in one of her supports, which for a one-chapter boss is quite impressive. That said, the fact she is fought in chapter 19a, as in one of the split paths, does hurt her status a little, since you might finish the entire game without ever seeing her. But fortunately for Segun, her competition is so weak I would have her as my pick regardless. You know, maybe the reason Binding Blade has so few memorable bosses is because Eliwood, Hector and Lyn killed them all. Because man, the Blazing Blade has a lot of memorable bosses, it really sticks out. Before revealing the admittedly predictable winner though, I want to give a shout out to Bad and the Beast and Glass for their ridiculous confidence while being the first bosses in Lyn mode of all places. But of course, the most memorable boss of the West's first ever Fire Emblem game is none other than the walking PA system that is Denning. Sure, he's more of a joke character than a serious boss who considers the morality of the world, but jokes can be incredibly memorable. That said, don't underestimate the value Denning still holds from a storytelling perspective. It really says a lot about Nergal that he would create a morph purely for this purpose. It makes clear this immense power of his is nothing more difficult than writing a letter from his perspective. For Sacred Stones, I'm gonna nominate someone who I guess you could argue shouldn't really count, but nah, I'm gonna do so anyway. Because even if Orson wasn't a playable character at some point and didn't have a pre-existing connection with Ephraim and Erica, he would still be among the most memorable bosses in Fire Emblem history. The situation with his wife Monica is such a tragic, painful and morbid moment that has really had no equal in the entire series, even up until this point. It's incredible how much this scene can really do without showing us anything more than the portraits of Orson and later Seth and Ephraim. I won't pretend to remember too much about Orson as a boss from a gameplay perspective, but that isn't really necessary here. This scene says all it needs to say about who he is as a person, both the good and the bad, and it makes him incredibly memorable. We continue with the two Tellius titles, starting with Path of Radiance of course, which has pretty solid bosses all around. Since the tone of this title is quite serious though, the ones that stand out the most are those that have a little fun with it all. The Jolly Pirate Nadeda is a good example, but he loses out to Schaefer for my nomination. Because while both are bosses with a humorous purpose, the data is found in the early game, where you kind of expect it. Schaefer is fought at the end of the game, where the tone is basically serious all around, meaning that his odd appearance makes more impact. This guy has surrounded himself with priests, who he uses as meat shields for Ike's army to carve through. While that isn't necessarily funny in and of itself, the way he talks about it and handles it is such a tonal shift from this part of the game that it makes for a super memorable boss. I mean, just hear his death quote. Should have brought more priests or babies, dang. This man's final word is dang. How could we ever forget him? For Radiant Dawn, I think a similar approach is in order, but the fact of the matter is that this game doesn't have any bosses that are as ridiculous as Schaefer or even the Data. The one who probably comes closest is Septimus, who technically appears in like 2 chapters instead of 1, but he's fairly minor regardless. Now, at first sight, Septimus seems to be quite a predictable enemy general. He thinks highly of himself, considers you not a threat, blah blah blah, boring boring boring. But do as much as mention the Lagoose around him and his entire character changes. This man is scared of your beastly units in a way very few characters in Radiant Dawn are. Because, well, he is far from the only character to consider them subhuman, he is the only one that actively fears battling with them out of fear they will tear him to shreds. Full uncensored fear is not an emotion many Fire Emblem bosses are allowed to show, and it makes Septimus all the more memorable for it. Then we get to Awakening, which in my opinion has the most memorable minor bosses out of every single Fire Emblem game. In fact, if you ask me, the runner-up of this game is arguably more memorable than like 90% of the bosses I have so far covered in this video. Who that runner-up is, however, that is a very tricky question. Because here we truly have a difficult duel between Mustafa, a serious boss who is incredibly memorable due to his character and mindset, and Cervantes, whose mustache makes for an excellent joke and hard to forget face. And well, I love how basically everything about Cervantes revolves around his mustache, from his death quote or his personalization. I feel like we must give flowers to how Mustafa is essentially the perfection of the Camus archetype. He doesn't surrender, but it is clear he is a man of honor and has his heart in the right place. He was just born in a different homeland. He offers the shepherds the chance not to fight, he orders his men not to attack the thieves looming around, he allows every soldier to desert if they want to, and even his final words harken back to his wish to keep his men safe. Later, through a support conversation between Henry and Rickon, we learn Mustafa saw and treated him as his own son, which only just further confirms how good a man Mustafa was. Combine all that with the fact that he is the boss of one of Awakening's most memorable chapters to begin with, and he is getting my vote. That and Cervantes and his glorious mustache technically appear in 2 chapters, so yeah. Next up is Fates, where we are of course gonna count capturable bosses, otherwise we'd have basically no picks left. While this bunch definitely has solid designs, I do think they're a bit less memorable than what we saw in Awakening, something that can of course be remedied with the fact you can actually use them yourself. While I do like Candace, she's a very unique boss in terms of design and character, I would say Kumagira has her beat. Not only does he have an awesome and super unique design, he's also a pretty strong unit, arguably the best capturable boss from a gameplay perspective. While Fates makes it quite hard for a minor boss to stand out in the sea of full-fledged units who also double as bosses in the other route, I think Kumagira does the best job of making himself memorable. On to Three Houses, which is a difficult one for an entirely different reason. The world building in this game is so incredibly well done that it barely has any truly minor bosses. Even characters who really only appear in 1 chapter feel like full-fledged characters with their own backstory and place in the world. Take Kostas, most basic chapter 1 bandit ever, and yet due to the fact that Edelgard hired him to kill the students, he actually plays a fairly major role in the story of the game. Leonardo, same thing. Boss of 1 chapter only, but Ash won't shut up about him until the credits roll. But hey, we can't exactly disregard all of these, we'll just have to tiptoe the line between who is a minor boss and who is a character. Someone who is really in a grey area in my opinion is Miklon, who is honestly a pretty minor figure in Three Houses, but becomes a full-fledged character in Three Hopes, to the point it's hard to separate the two. So instead, I went for someone who truly hits every characteristic of a minor boss, Kronya. She may be the killer of Gerald, she may be the replacement of Monica, but Kronya really only appears in 1 chapter. We've never heard of her before, we never hear from her afterwards, she just has an incredibly memorable performance when she gets the spotlight. And that's exactly what this video is about at the end of the day. And finally we have Engage, which really has barely any minor bosses to begin with. Not really much space for them anyway, considering we have to fight the hounds like 25 times. However, one figure did manage to sneak in his recognizable face before those entered the scene, being Genealogy, the boss of chapter 5. Surely I'm not the only one who expected this guy to become a reoccurring boss the first time around, right? His design is quite striking, not generic at all, and he even retreats after you defeat him in battle, only to then be killed by Zephyia in the cutscene that followed. So yeah, I didn't get to sit with that thought for long, but I was fully counting on seeing him again later down the line. While that wasn't meant to be, I do think he is easily the most memorable minor boss in Engage. And with that, we have covered them all. Which minor bosses have stuck with you? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel to stay updated on all my future Fire Emblem content coming up. For now, thanks for watching and enjoy the rest of your day.